You are lying in the half-dark of a medieval chamber, where the flicker of a single candle paints shadows on stone walls. The air smells faintly of beeswax, smoke, and old wood. In the year 1137, Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most remarkable women in medieval Europe, lay down in her bedchamber as a new queen of France. Yet the chamber was not just a place for sleep. It was a stage, a fortress, and a political arena. When you think of a bed, you probably think of comfort, privacy, and perhaps intimacy. In Eleanor's world, the bed was something far more significant. It was where marriages were sealed before witnesses, where heirs were conceived, and where power itself was negotiated. The bedchamber was less about what you did beneath the sheets, and more about who was allowed to see it. Eleanor's bed was not the modest, straw-stuffed sack of a peasant woman. Hers was a vast wooden structure, carved from oak, raised high above the floor, and dressed in thick curtains that could enclose her in darkness or open to the view of an audience. Beds in noble houses were not only for sleeping, they were for displaying wealth. Linen sheets might be embroidered with gold thread, pillows stuffed with feathers instead of chaff, and coverlets woven in rich crimson or deep blue. The canopy was as symbolic as the throne. Draped velvet tassels and silks declared that the body resting beneath them mattered. You must imagine that the chamber itself was rarely private. Ladies-in-waiting came and went, servants stoked fires, and courtiers lingered near the door. For Eleanor, lying down was never fully her own choice. It was part of being a queen. When Eleanor married Louis VII of France, their union was not just blessed in the cathedral, but staged again in the bedchamber. Medieval marriages were not considered fully binding until they had been consummated. Witnesses, sometimes family, sometimes clergy, would lead the couple into the bed, sometimes even staying in the room long enough to hear the rustling of sheets before politely withdrawing. Imagine the awkwardness. For Eleanor, barely 15, the bed was less about personal intimacy and more about duty. She carried with her not only the expectations of producing an heir, but the immense weight of uniting Aquitaine, one of the richest duchies in Europe, with the crown of France. Every turn of her body, every sigh under those sheets, was freighted with political consequence. Eleanor's chamber did not belong to her alone. Her ladies-in-waiting prepared her clothes, unfastened her headdress at night, and brushed out her long hair. The chambermaids laid down carpets or rushes, removed chamber pots, and adjusted the bed linens. Even her most private moments were rarely without eyes. The daily routine revolved around the rhythm of prayer and duty. Before bed, psalms might be whispered. A crucifix often hung above the bedstead, reminding the queen that even in sleep, God was watching. Her sleep would not have been as restful as yours. Beds were cold in winter, hot in summer, and the movement of servants, guards, and family members was a constant reminder that solitude was almost impossible. The bedchamber was also a place of politics. Audiences sometimes took place at the bedside. When illness prevented the queen from rising, letters were dictated in the soft half-light of dawn. Eleanor's authority, even confined to her chamber, extended beyond those curtains. Her bed symbolized fertility, alliance, and continuity. It is important to remember, in the medieval world, the private was never fully private. The marriage bed was a matter of state, not just of flesh. Eleanor's bedchamber was where history itself unfolded. Here lies the contradiction. The bed was supposed to be the most intimate of spaces, yet for queens like Eleanor, it was always semi-public. Her body was a vessel of politics, her womb a battleground for dynasties. To be a wife in medieval Europe was to live in a paradox, at once exalted and exposed. You can picture Eleanor, beneath heavy drapery, listening to the distant bells of the Cathedral of Poitiers, wondering if she was ever truly alone. Did she feel the crushing expectations? Did she long for the bed to be her own, a place of rest rather than display? Or did she accept that the bed, like the crown, was a burden she could never set aside? In this first glimpse of Eleanor's bedchamber, you have seen how a simple piece of furniture became a symbol of dynasty, alliance, and power. But this was only the beginning of her story. Eleanor's marriage to Louis VII would bring conflict, separation, and eventually scandal, all of which began in those bedchambers. The question remains, when a queen's bed was a political stage, could she ever find true intimacy within it? When you imagine Eleanor lying in her marriage bed beside Louis VII, you must picture not only to bodies but to entire kingdoms pressed into that narrow space. The union between Aquitaine and France was a fragile alliance, stitched together, not only with vows but with sheets. Every night Eleanor spent in that bed was scrutinized by courtiers, whispered about by chroniclers, and remembered by ambassadors. Her private life was never hers to guard. It was Europe's to dissect. At the core of Eleanor's marriage was one expectation: produce a son. The survival of dynasties rested on heirs, and a queen's body was expected to perform this duty with quiet efficiency. But for years, Eleanor bore only daughters. Each child was swaddled in cloth, baptized, and celebrated. But the absence of a male heir hung heavy over the royal bed. Imagine the tension in those chambers. Louis VII, devout and serious, prayed fervently for a son. Eleanor, pragmatic and fiercely intelligent, likely understood that her position was weakening with each passing year. The bed, which should have been a sanctuary, became a daily reminder of failure. For the court, her womb was not her own, it was a national concern. While outwardly obedient, Eleanor's spirit was restless. Raised in the cultured courts of Aquitaine, she was accustomed to music, poetry, and lively discussion. In contrast, Louis's court was austere, his devotion to God leaving little room for worldly pleasures. Their bed symbolized this clash of temperaments. For Eleanor, intimacy may have been a matter of wit and passion. For Louis, it was duty and prayer. Confessors and priests advised Louis on how and when to approach the marriage bed, urging moderation, avoidance of sin, and attention to holy days. Sexual life was not spontaneous, but carefully managed by clerical instruction. Eleanor, fiery and independent, may have chafed at these restrictions. Behind the curtains, where passion should have burned, there was likely silence, frustration, and resignation. In royal courts, the bedding ceremony was a performance. After banquets, the bride and groom were led to the chamber, the bed blessed, and the couple tucked in while guests looked on. It was both spectacle and surveillance, ensuring that the marriage could not be later denied. For Eleanor, these ceremonies stripped intimacy away entirely. The bed was a stage, the couple actors in a play written by dynasties. Yet these rituals carried immense power. By lying down together before witnesses, Eleanor and Louis enacted the union of Aquitaine and France in flesh. Every time their bed was mentioned, it was not as to lovers, but as the physical proof of political alliance. In 1147, Louis embarked on the Second Crusade, and Eleanor accompanied him. Their marriage bed now shifted across continents, from stone castles in France to makeshift tents in the heat of Antioch. Imagine the discomfort of silk sheets laid over hard ground, the sounds of soldiers echoing through the night, and the stench of war invading even the most private corners. Here, the marriage bed was further politicized. Eleanor was accused of being too close to her uncle, Raymond of Antioch, and whispers of infidelity spread like wildfire. Whether true or not, these rumors revealed the fragility of her position. A queen's bed could not simply be her own. It was the property of the court, open to speculation and scandal. By the time Eleanor and Louis returned from the crusade, the marriage had soured beyond repair. The lack of a male heir, the clash of personalities, and the persistent rumors created a storm that no bed could weather. In 1152, their marriage was annulled on grounds of consanguinity. They were too closely related by blood. But beneath the legal language lay a truth everyone knew. Their bed had failed to serve its dynastic purpose. Eleanor left that union with her freedom, her lands, and her strength intact. Within months, she remarried, this time to Henry Plantagenet, future Henry II of England. Once again, the bedchamber became her battlefield, but with new stakes, new heirs, and new struggles. You have now followed Eleanor from her youthful bedchamber in France to the strained sheets of crusader tents, and finally to the breaking point of annulment. The marriage bed, meant to bind France and Aquitaine, had instead unraveled into political disaster. But Eleanor's story did not end there. Her second marriage would bring her to one of the most powerful thrones in Europe, and her bedchamber would once again shape dynasties, rebellions, and history itself. The question lingers: in her second marriage to Henry II, would Eleanor finally find power within the bed, or would it once more become her cage? When Eleanor left Louis VII of France, many assumed her story was one of quiet dismissal, a queen set aside for failing to produce a male heir. But within weeks, she defied expectation. Riding back to her Duchy of Aquitaine, Eleanor made a bold decision. She would remarry, and not to just anyone. She wed Henry Plantagenet, the ambitious Duke of Normandy, who within 2 years would ascend the English throne as Henry II. Thus, Eleanor's bedchamber became the foundation of a new empire stretching from the Pyrenees to the borders of Scotland, where her first marriage bed had been a place of disappointment. Her second became a crucible of power. Henry was nearly a decade younger than Eleanor, vigorous and commanding. Their union was no mere formality. Unlike her constrained life with Louis, Eleanor now found herself with a partner whose appetite for both rule and intimacy matched her own. Their bed, once again surrounded by servants and courtiers, became the stage for a new dynasty. This time, heirs arrived quickly. Sons were born: William, Henry, the young king, Richard, Geoffrey, and John, alongside daughters Matilda, Eleanor, and Joanna. Each birth was a triumph, each cradle an affirmation of the Plantagenet claim to greatness. the marriage bed, once a reminder of failure, now overflowed with fertility. But children are not only blessings, they are weapons in dynastic struggles. Eleanor's many sons would one day become rivals, not only to each other, but to their father. The very heirs she delivered into the world became pawns in battles for succession, treaties, and rebellion. The queen's bedchamber became a factory of kings, and each son carried a portion of her influence. Richard, later called the Lionheart, was Eleanor's favorite, a warrior molded in her image. John, the youngest, would become infamous for tyranny. Each boy was born of the same bed, yet each carried a different legacy that would shape Europe for centuries. If passion united Eleanor and Henry at first, ambition eventually divided them. Henry's infidelities grew notorious, and the queen, who had once been a prized bride, found herself set aside in favor of mistresses. The bedchamber, once vibrant, became another place of betrayal. Eleanor did not retreat. Instead, she turned her attention to her children, supporting their claims against their father. In 1173, she aided her sons in open rebellion against Henry. Imagine the irony. The same womb that had given him heirs now fueled his undoing. The queen who had once shared his bed now raised armies against him. Henry crushed the rebellion, and Eleanor was captured. For nearly 16 years, she was kept under house arrest, her chambers guarded, her movements restricted. The queen who had once ruled courts and beds alike now lived in forced solitude. Her bed was no longer a place of power, but of confinement. And yet, even here, her presence endured. Letters carried her influence. Her reputation grew, and her sons never forgot her strength. The bedchamber that had once seemed like a cage became, paradoxically, a place of survival. Eleanor waited, quietly, until history turned again in her favor. When Henry II died in 1189, Eleanor emerged from captivity at nearly 70 years old. She immediately rode across England, securing her son Richard's succession. From her chamber, she issued orders, received emissaries, and even arranged royal marriages. No longer was her bed merely a place of dynastic obligation. It had become her command post. Even in her later years, when age confined her body, Eleanor's chamber remained a hub of politics. She negotiated alliances, settled disputes, and preserved the Plantagenet legacy. She died in 1204 at the Abbey of Fontevraud, where her effigy still shows her reclining on a stone bed, a book in her hands, as though history itself was her final companion. The bedchamber of Eleanor of Aquitaine tells us more than any battlefield or throne room could. It was there that dynasties were forged, alliances broken, heirs conceived, and rebellions born. The bed was not a symbol of comfort, but of power and peril. For Eleanor, the bed was never hers alone. It belonged to kingdoms, to heirs, to history itself. And yet, through it all, she carved her own path, defiant, enduring, and unforgettable. As you close your eyes, imagine her final bed at Fontevraud, not surrounded by courtiers or guards, but carved in stone, peaceful at last. The queen who had once turned her bed into an empire now lies in eternal rest, her story woven into every thread of Europe's past. You are standing in a dim chamber filled with the scent of rosemary and lavender. A fire glows low in the hearth. while women bustle quietly around a young bride. Her gown is heavy, her hands tremble, and her fate is sealed. She is not entering merely a bed, but a new life. For medieval brides, the marriage bed was a threshold. It was the place where childhood ended and womanhood began. It was also a place where family, honor, political alliance, and even entire kingdoms were placed upon her body. That first night was surrounded by ritual, fear, and preparation, both physical and spiritual. Before stepping into her bridal chamber, a bride was often bathed. This was not the casual soak of leisure, but a symbolic washing away of the past. Servants or female relatives would pour warm water infused with herbs such as sage or mint, meant to cleanse, soothe, and perhaps even guard against evil. In noble households, the bath itself could be elaborate. A wooden tub lined with cloth, candles flickering, and women whispering prayers for fertility to you. It may seem invasive, even embarrassing, but for the bride it was expected. Her body was being readied, not just for her husband, but for the scrutiny of an entire family. In many cases, even the linens used in her bath would later be examined as tokens of her purity. Hair held powerful symbolism. Brides often wore their hair loose on the wedding day, a mark of virginity. But once the bath was done, her hair was carefully combed, braided, and covered. This transformation marked her passage from maiden to wife. The act of braiding was slow, deliberate, and layered with meaning. Each twist of hair was a reminder that she was being bound, woven into the fabric of her husband's household. In some regions, a bride's headdress was placed on her head by older women of the family, as though to remind her, "You will walk the same path we once walked." Imagine the pressure, the whispers, the unspoken lessons. The gown she wore to bed was rarely chosen by her. In wealthier courts, white linen shifts embroidered with symbols of chastity were common. For peasants, it might be a simple chemise, freshly washed. Either way, it was modest, loose, and symbolic of new beginnings. Over her shift, she might wear a thin girdle or ribbon, sometimes blessed by priests to protect her from infertility or evil spirits. Some regions practiced the custom of giving the bride a belt or garter inscribed with prayers. To loosen this belt was the husband's privilege, but it was also a gesture loaded with expectation, proof that the marriage was real. The bed itself was prepared with as much care as the bride. Sheets were freshly laid, sometimes sprinkled with herbs like thyme or rose petals to bring luck and ward off illness. In noble courts, relics of saints were placed near the pillows. Even candles burned in specific ways, some to light the room, others to protect against spirits thought to lurk in the dark. In some traditions, the bed was blessed by clergy, transforming it into both a sacred and secular space. The sheets were not only for rest, but for evidence. Blood-stained linens were, in many places, the ultimate proof of a bride's virginity and a family's honor. You can feel the weight of that expectation pressing on the quiet chamber. Perhaps the most intimate part of the preparation was advice. Older women, mothers, aunts, servants, whispered instructions to the bride. Some offered comforting words, others warnings. Be obedient, do not resist, remember your duty. A few might whisper secrets of pleasure, but most advice was about endurance, not enjoyment. For the young bride, many had never been alone with a man before. much less seen the body of one unclothed. Her heart may have raced, her hands cold, her mind full of questions she could not dare to ask aloud. The walk to the marriage bed was slow. In great halls, music and laughter might still echo, guests lingering outside to ensure the ritual was observed. In peasant homes, it was simpler, but no less important. For every bride, whether cloaked in velvet or plain wool, the moment was the same: step into a chamber that symbolized both the start of a family and the loss of herself as an individual. The first night was less about love than about lineage. To prepare was to surrender, not to passion, but to expectation. And yet, within this web of ritual and fear, there may have been flickers of hope that perhaps the man waiting for her beyond those curtains might be kind. You now see how every step toward the marriage bed was ritualized, washed, braided, clothed, and counseled into submission. But preparation was only the beginning. What happened once the curtains closed was even more bound to the weight of custom, law, and scrutiny. The question lingers: once the door was shut, did the bride truly step into her own life, or was she stepping into a role written for her long before her birth? The door closed, and with it the noise of the feast faded. What remained was the hush of firelight and the shallow sound of breathing. For a medieval bride, the moment she had been prepared for was no longer a ritual led by women or priests. It was now a moment of reckoning, played out in silence behind drawn curtains. The marriage bed was not a place of ease. It was a place of proof. On that first night, what mattered most was not the comfort of two people, but the evidence that a union had truly taken place. Families waited outside. Servants lingered in nearby rooms. In noble households, the linens themselves would be inspected. The next morning, what happened between two bodies was not only theirs, it was shared with an audience they could not see. For the bride, there was the uncertainty of the unknown. Few women had been told what would actually happen. Instead, they had been given fragments of instruction: to be still, to be obedient, to remember that this moment was for lineage, not for her. If she trembled, it was not only from fear of pain, but from the knowledge that her worth in the eyes of her husband's family rested on what would be discovered in the sheets come dawn. The groom, to bore his own burden, a nobleman's masculinity, was measured not only in battle, but in bed. Failure to perform was failure of duty. Chroniclers recorded stories of kings whose marriages were annulled on grounds of impotence. The marriage bed could unmake a dynasty before it began. And so both husband and wife, strangers in so many ways, were bound together by expectation, each carrying the weight of their family's name on their shoulders. For peasants, the bed was simpler, yet the same pressure hung in the air. The straw mattress, the plain linen, the lack of ceremony did not lessen the importance. Villagers whispered, neighbors gossiped, and honor was as fragile in a village as it was in a royal court. Even in the humblest cottages, a bride stepped into the bed with the knowledge that her body was no longer hers alone. There were prayers spoken before the act, sometimes whispered by the husband, sometimes murmured by both. Priests had long instructed couples that marital union was permitted but dangerous if done in excess, a necessary duty for the production of children. Pleasure was secondary, even suspect. The Church reminded men and women that this moment was not for lust but for life. And yet, how could two bodies pressed together, not feel the pull of something beyond duty. The first nights were rarely gentle. Many brides endured them rather than embraced them. Some were injured, others wept in silence. Few dared speak of what they felt. If the groom was kind, there might be tenderness. If he was not, the night was endured as another form of obedience. For the bride, her silence was as much a part of the ritual as her body. She was expected to yield, to accept, to transform from girl into wife without complaint. Yet not all was fear and pain. For some, intimacy became a form of connection. There were men who approached their brides with patience, and there were women who, despite the weight of expectation, found comfort in the warmth of another body. The stories that survive are mostly written by men, monks, and clerics, voices that spoke of duty, sin, and purity. But behind those silences, there must have been moments of tenderness, secret and unrecorded, that passed between bride and groom as the fire burned low. In noble households, witnesses sometimes accompanied the couple into the chamber. They lingered long enough to see the bride laid in bed, to watch the groom join her, and then quietly departed. It was a strange intrusion, a reminder that this act was as much contract as consummation. The door closed, the curtains were drawn, but the presence of others never fully left the room. The bride knew that whatever happened next would be known, or at least guessed at, by those outside. When morning came, the test was not whether two people had rested well, but whether proof could be displayed. Sheets were inspected for blood, the stain of virginity lost. Families celebrated when it was found, whispering their relief. If it was absent, excuses were made, doubts arose, and sometimes accusations followed. A woman's honor, a man's virility, and the legitimacy of the marriage itself could all be questioned on the basis of a single piece of cloth. A bride of 15, barely past childhood, waking to the knowledge that her body's private secrets would be judged by eyes that had not shared her bed. The sheets carried more weight than her voice, more authority than her own testimony. In some courts, they were even displayed as proof to wider audiences. Her private life was, from the very first night, transformed into public evidence. For those who bore noble titles, the implications reached even further. A queen's chamber was the birthplace of heirs, the cradle of dynasties. If she failed, treaties faltered, alliances weakened, and enemies stirred. If she succeeded, the child she bore might one day wear a crown. For peasants, the stakes were smaller, but no less personal. A marriage without children was a household without labor, a farm without hands, a family without future. The bed was the root from which everything grew. Over time, the first nights faded into routine. Couples learned one another's rhythms, some with affection, others with cold duty. Yet that first experience lingered in memory, sometimes as dread, sometimes as relief. It was not easily forgotten, for it was the moment when two lives were bound together under the scrutiny of others, with the weight of future generations pressing down upon them. The bride who had been washed, braided, clothed, and counseled, now discovered that preparation had been only the beginning. The real transformation took place in silence, beneath curtains heavy with expectation. Whatever she felt, joy, pain, confusion, resignation, was hers alone to carry. Few would ask her, fewer still would care. Her role was to bear, to endure, to fulfill the promise written into her vows and sealed in her sheets. And yet, if you lean closer to those dim medieval chambers, you might sense something unspoken. A glance between two young people who, for the first time, saw each other not as actors in a ritual, but as human beings. A hand held longer than necessary, a breath shared, a moment of recognition that beneath the duties imposed upon them, they were still flesh and spirit, caught in the same uncertainty. In those rare instants, the marriage bed may have become something more than a stage. It may have become a place of fragile connection. But the question lingers: was the bride's first night truly her own beginning? Or was it simply the first chapter in a script she had no power to change? The years passed, and the bride who once trembled on her first night soon learned the rhythms of her new life. The bed, which had been a place of fear and uncertainty, became a fixture as ordinary as the hearth or the table. And yet, it was never just a place to sleep. It was the measure of her success, the site of her greatest duties, and the stage on which her worth was judged again and again. Her mornings began with the evidence of the night. If children came, the household rejoiced, the family name strengthened, and the bride herself rose in stature. If they did not, whispers began. People spoke of curses, of divine punishment, of hidden faults in the body of the woman. The husband's failures were often hidden, excused, or forgiven, but the wife's womb carried the blame. She bore it silently, lying night after night under expectations that pressed heavier than the blankets that covered her. For those who conceived, pregnancy was no less a burden than a triumph. The body that had been prepared for the wedding bed was now reshaped by childbirth again and again. Some women survived 10, 12, even 15 births, their strength spent by the demands of lineage. In noble houses, each child was a pawn, betrothed in infancy, promised to secure alliances. In villages, children meant survival, hands to tend the fields, voices to carry the family name. For both noble and common, the labor of the bed never truly ended, and yet, behind the weight of duty, there were quiet stories of adaptation. Some brides grew close to their husbands, finding companionship in shared struggles. Others carved out small spaces of autonomy, choosing the rhythm of their household, managing servants, or controlling the flow of goods through their hands. For them, the bed was not only a place of surrender, but a tool of quiet influence. The intimacy of a marriage gave them leverage. Whispered words in the dark, sometimes shaping decisions made in daylight. Not all were fortunate. Some brides found themselves married to men far older, men who cared little for kindness, men who saw the bed only as a place to assert power. For these women, the chamber became a prison, its curtains drawn tight, not for privacy, but for control. Their silence was enforced, their choices erased, and their futures bound by vows spoken long before they understood their meaning. Over time, a woman's reputation became inseparable from her bed. A faithful wife who bore children was praised as virtuous. A barren wife was pitied, gossiped about, or cast aside. A woman suspected of infidelity carried the risk of ruin, for even a hint of betrayal could threaten the legitimacy of children and the stability of inheritance. In this way, the marriage bed held not only bodies, but entire family lines. Fragile and exposed to rumor, the church continued to shape what unfolded between husband and wife. Priests preached about the dangers of desire, urging restraint, forbidding intimacy on holy days, during Lent, on Sundays, and even during certain phases of the moon. The list of forbidden nights sometimes seemed longer than those permitted. Yet human nature rarely obeyed so neatly. Couples continued, quietly bending the rules, pretending obedience, while living according to their own needs. The gap between doctrine and practice was as wide in the bed as it was in the marketplace. For the bride herself, the greatest transformation was internal. She entered the marriage bed as a girl shaped by ritual, by instruction, by the hands of women who braided her hair and whispered obedience. She emerged from it over the years as something different, a wife who had learned the balance between submission and survival, silence and influence, endurance and adaptation. Her role had been imposed upon her, yet within it she carved her own shape, sometimes softly, sometimes with defiance. The stories of medieval brides are not often told. Chroniclers wrote of kings, battles, and treaties. They rarely recorded the quiet nights when a woman lay awake beside her husband, staring into darkness, wondering if she would bear another child, if she would live through the birth, if her daughters would face the same fate. And yet, it was in those beds, more than on any battlefield, that the future of kingdoms was decided. Imagine the countless chambers across Europe, from the smoky cottages of peasants to the velvet-draped rooms of queens. Each held the same pattern. A young woman prepared, guided, and handed over to expectation. Each night she bore the weight of family, of lineage, of survival. Each morning she carried forward the evidence of her duty, whether in a child, in silence, or in the whispered judgments of others. In the end, the medieval bride's preparation for the marriage bed was not just about one night. It was about a lifetime of nights, each one binding her further into a role that was at once personal and profoundly public. The rituals of washing, braiding, and blessing were only the beginning. What followed was the slow shaping of a life lived under the gaze of others, where even the most private act was never entirely her own. And so you are left with a question. Did these women, bound by duty and ritual, ever find true ownership of their own beds? Or did they simply pass through them as actors in a script written long before they were born? The cloisters were quiet at night, yet even there the marriage bed was never far from the minds of monks and priests. For while they themselves had vowed chastity, it was their duty to regulate the intimate lives of others. Across medieval Europe, the rules of the bed were as much a matter of church law as of private desire. A husband and wife could not simply turn to one another whenever they wished. They were bound by calendars, fasts, feasts, and holy days that stretched across the year like chains. Imagine a young couple in a small village. They had married in the spring, their bed little more than a straw mattress covered in rough linen. The desire to be together was natural, but they carried with them the weight of sermons delivered every Sunday. Priests reminded them that union was permitted, but only in moderation, only for the sake of children, and never on days of worship. And those days were many. Advent forbade intimacy. Lent forbade it. So too did Easter, Christmas, Pentecost, and even saints' feast days. If they obeyed fully, nearly half the year was closed to them. Confessors asked blunt questions. When a husband knelt for confession, he might be asked how often he approached his wife, whether it was for lust or for lineage. A wife, too, might be interrogated, her body treated as a matter of law. The church books contained long lists of permitted and forbidden nights, and confessors were trained to inquire with unsettling precision. Desire was not seen as a gift, but as a danger, something to be fenced in by rules. These prohibitions shaped not only private life, but the rhythm of households. Some couples complied, their nights guided by calendars more than by passion. Others quietly ignored the restrictions, trusting that their confessions would wipe away their disobedience. But the fear of sin lingered. Each time a husband touched his wife, he was reminded that the church might call it excess. Each time a wife yielded, she carried the knowledge that what happened beneath the sheets was watched, in some sense, by unseen eyes. In monasteries, the rules were written with even greater detail. Texts like the penitentials manuals for confessors out penances for every kind of marital act. A man who approached his wife on a Sunday might be ordered to fast for several days. A woman who resisted her husband too often could be accused of sinning against duty. Even the positions in which intimacy occurred were regulated, with certain acts condemned as unnatural. The marriage bed was thus less a place of freedom than a cage of instructions, overseen by men who themselves had sworn never to enter it. And yet, couples found ways to navigate these rules. In the privacy of their chambers, many ignored what priests demanded. Human longing is stubborn, and no calendar could erase it. Still, guilt seeped in. Imagine a wife lying awake after a night with her husband, whispering prayers for forgiveness before dawn. Imagine a husband counting the days to see if their union had fallen on a forbidden feast. The rules reached into their beds like cold hands, turning passion into calculation. The irony was sharp. The church preached restraint to protect the soul, but in practice it often magnified the sense of sin. Ordinary men and women who sought only comfort in each other now carried an invisible burden. The bed was not only their own, it belonged also to the priests who dictated its boundaries. For those of high rank, the scrutiny was even greater. Kings and queens could not ignore the laws of the church, for their enemies would use every transgression as weapon. If a royal couple was known to disobey, it could be grounds for scandal, annulment, or political attack. Thus, even in the grandest chambers, with beds hung in velvet and silk, the same anxieties haunted the night. And so, across Europe, marriage unfolded under the shadow of monasteries. Bells rang to mark holy days, and with them came reminders of restraint. Priests preached of chastity, monks copied rules into thick books, and confessors probed into private lives with questions few dared answer honestly. The marriage bed was at once a place of intimacy and of surveillance, caught between the warmth of human touch and the cold authority of the church. The question that lingers is this: when the church filled the chamber with so many invisible rules, did it preserve the sanctity of marriage, or did it steal from couples the simple right to belong wholly to one another? The bells of the monastery tolled in the distance, and in countless villages the sound carried into the homes of husbands and wives. Each ring was a reminder that their most private lives were measured by the same rhythm as the prayers of monks. The marriage bed, though hidden behind wooden doors and woven curtains, was bound to those bells. When they marked a feast day, passion was forbidden. When they marked the beginning of Lent, weeks of restraint lay ahead. The weight of religion pressed down as heavily as any blanket. Confessors were relentless in their attention. Manuals instructed them to ask husbands whether they had approached their wives on forbidden nights, whether they had done so with lust rather than duty, and whether they had attempted anything outside the narrow confines of sanctioned union. Wives, too, were questioned. Had they resisted their husbands unjustly? Had they tempted them? Had they desired too much? To speak of such things aloud was already uncomfortable. To be judged for them was worse. Yet the penances were written clearly, with fasts, prayers, and humiliations assigned like punishments for theft. The fear of sin crept into the smallest details. If a child was conceived at the wrong time during Lent, for example, some believed that child might carry a curse or be marked by weakness. Mothers worried over their babies not only in the cradle but in the memory of the bed where they were conceived. The Church's rules did not end at the sheets. They stretched forward into the lives of the children themselves, giving every union the weight of eternal consequence. And yet, the reality of life often pressed harder than the rules. In small cottages, where winter nights were long and beds were the only warmth, couples often ignored prohibitions. To choose abstinence on every holy day was to choose cold and loneliness. In noble courts, where heirs were demanded, the urgency of producing children often outweighed the caution of priests. Husbands might ignore the calendar, wives might accept the sin, and both would simply confess later, trusting absolution to sweep away their disobedience. Still, the rules shaped the way people thought about themselves. A wife might lie awake, wondering if she had tempted her husband into excess. A husband might confess his desires with shame, as though longing for his wife was itself a failure. This guilt, repeated night after night, reshaped intimacy into something tinged with suspicion. Love was never free from the shadow of penance. There were stories whispered in monasteries of couples punished for disobedience, though how much was truth and how much was cautionary tale is difficult to know. A man who came too often to his wife was said to risk weakness in his limbs or the dulling of his mind. A woman who welcomed her husband too eagerly was accused of being dangerous, of tempting him toward sin. The marriage bed was supposed to be the foundation of family and faith, yet it was often described as a trap, where desire and duty collided in ways no one could fully reconcile. Even kings were not immune. Chronicles tell of rulers rebuked by churchmen for neglecting the fasts or for treating their wives with too much affection. A king who flaunted the rules risked more than spiritual censure. He risked the Church's disfavor, which could unravel alliances or weaken his claim. Thus, even in great halls, under embroidered canopies, the bed was watched over by unseen clerical eyes. Its every use a matter of politics as well as piety, and so husbands and wives learned to balance two calendars, one of the Church, crowded with holy days, and one of the body, ruled by longing and need. Some followed the first and silenced the second. Others quietly allowed the second to prevail, and trusted that their confessions would cleanse what their hearts could not deny. It was a dance performed in silence, night after night, as couples navigated between sin and survival. The lingering question is not whether they obeyed perfectly, for few likely did, but whether obedience itself ever truly brought peace. Did the weight of rules make the bond holier, or did it make the bed colder? The night stretched long, and in every corner of Europe the same quiet struggle repeated itself. A husband reached for his wife, and somewhere in the back of his mind came the echo of a sermon warning him of excess. A wife turned toward her husband, and with her touch came the fear that too much eagerness might be judged as sin. The bed, meant to be the most intimate place in a household, carried with it a constant whisper of the monastery, as though the cloistered walls themselves reached out into the chambers of the married. By the 12th century, these rules had hardened into law. Church councils set forth decrees, spelling out what had long been murmured by confessors. The prohibition multiplied: no intimacy on Sundays, none on feast days, none during Lent, none during Advent, none before receiving communion, none after childbirth, until a priest had performed purification. For some couples, nearly half the year was struck through with restrictions. It was as though marriage itself was tolerated only reluctantly, a necessary evil granted to the weak of flesh, and yet the reality remained. The world continued to turn on the children born from those beds. Villages depended on new hands to till fields, kings on heirs to carry crowns, families on bloodlines to endure. The church could legislate desire, but it could not erase it. Couples adjusted, sometimes following, sometimes ignoring, sometimes confessing and repeating the same sins again. The gap between doctrine and practice widened into a quiet rhythm of resistance. What is striking is how ordinary people endured these contradictions. They knelt in confession, admitted their failings, recited their penances, and then returned to their homes and their beds. They learned to carry the guilt like another blanket over their shoulders, familiar and expected. For them, intimacy was not a matter of romance, but of endurance, as much a duty as harvesting crops or kneading bread. The bed was an obligation wrapped in warmth, heavy with rules, yet impossible to set aside. Some resisted more openly. There were tales of men who dismissed the priest's cautions, declaring that their wives were theirs by right. There were women who quietly cherished moments of tenderness, ignoring the sermons that branded joy as excess. These small rebellions rarely made it into chronicles, yet they must have existed in every village and castle, for behind every public life was the quiet fact of a bed, and behind every bed was the simple truth that human longing cannot be wholly governed by law. And so the marriage bed, under monastic rules, became a paradox. It was condemned and sanctified, feared and required, restricted yet essential. It gave life to children who would one day become peasants, soldiers, queens, and kings, even as priests insisted it was an act best avoided. Couples lived with this contradiction, sometimes in guilt, sometimes in defiance, but always with the knowledge that their private nights were never wholly their own. As the candles burned low and the bells tolled again, the cycle renewed itself. Rules, written in cloisters, echoed into cottages, and bodies pressed together despite them. The church might claim mastery over the chamber, but the truth remained. The chamber belonged just as much to human need as to divine decree. And so you are left with the thought, were these countless couples truly living within the sanctity the church imagined? Or were they simply learning, in their own quiet way, how to bend rules so that life itself could go on. The great hall glowed with torchlight, music still drifting from the feast, and yet all eyes slowly turned toward a smaller chamber beyond. The time had come for the bedding ceremony, the strange and uneasy ritual that transformed a marriage from words into flesh. In castles across Europe, this moment was as carefully staged as a coronation. It was not enough for bride and groom to exchange vows before an altar. The union had to be seen, blessed, and, in a sense, performed for those who waited beyond. The curtains. The bride was led first, often by her female attendants. Her gown was loosened, her hair undone, her body draped in lighter linen, more suited to the bed. The groom followed, sometimes carried half-drunken from the revelry of the feast, his companions laughing as they urged him forward. Nobles crowded near the chamber door, jesting and whispering, as though eager to turn intimacy into spectacle. What lay ahead was both sacred and ridiculous, a blending of solemn duty and bawdy ritual in some courts. The ceremony was formal. Priests entered the chamber, sprinkled holy water over the bed, and offered prayers for fertility. Relics might be placed beneath the pillows, the sheets drawn back as though preparing an altar. The union of two houses, whether ducal, royal, or even imperial, was thought to hinge on what happened here. Without the physical act of consummation, treaties were fragile. Alliances could collapse, and heirs could not be claimed legitimate. In other places, the ritual was rowdier. Friends and attendants followed the couple into the chamber, sometimes stripping the groom down to his shift, sometimes tugging away the bride's outer garments while joking loudly. Laughter mixed with embarrassment, the couple's dignity set aside in the name of tradition. At last, the two were placed into the bed, tucked beneath the covers like children, while the guests watched or lingered until they were satisfied that the marriage could not be denied. Only then were the curtains drawn, the door closed, and the couple left to themselves. The strangeness of it lingers in the imagination. What we now consider private was, in medieval courts, a matter of public record. Chroniclers noted whether the bedding was properly performed, whether witnesses were present, even whether the couple seemed at ease. Kings and queens were not allowed to vanish quietly into their chambers. Their marriages were political bonds, and their bodies were required to seal them before an audience. For the bride, the ceremony was both humiliating and terrifying. She stood before her husband, perhaps barely acquainted with him, her body inspected, her modesty surrendered not only to him but to the crowd that pressed so near. For the groom, too, the pressure was immense. His manhood, his capacity to fulfill the expectations of dynasty was tested in those first moments. Failure could mean annulment, scandal, or ridicule that spread far beyond the walls of the chamber. Yet, for all its intrusiveness, the ceremony was also a performance of hope. Families leaned in with anticipation, courtiers whispered of heirs, and allies reassured themselves that the bond they had negotiated in treaties was now written in flesh. The bedding was a ritual of continuity, a way of saying that the night belonged not only to the couple, but to everyone whose fortunes depended on them. And once the crowd departed, the silence of the chamber must have felt immense. Bride and groom lay beneath heavy covers, the echoes of laughter and prayers still lingering. What followed was uncertain, tenderness or awkwardness, duty or avoidance. But the ceremony itself had already accomplished its purpose. by being seen, by being blessed, by being thrust into the bed before witnesses. The union was made undeniable. In this way, royal beds were never truly private. They were stages, watched and remembered, their sheets carrying the weight of kingdoms. The question remains, when the laughter faded and the curtains fell, could any royal couple truly believe the bed was theirs alone? The chamber was dim, the fire burning low, and yet the air was thick with the memory of the crowd that had just departed. For the royal couple, lying beneath the embroidered sheets, the weight of expectation pressed as heavily as the canopy overhead. The bedding ceremony had done its work. The marriage was now public, undeniable, recorded not only by witnesses but by the gossip that would spread through the court by morning. Still, the night itself was not finished. Servants lingered outside, waiting to be summoned if called. Lady Zine, waiting, whispered to one another in the corridor, speculating on whether the new bride would prove fertile, whether the groom would rise to his duty, whether heirs would be conceived on this very night. In truth, what happened after the curtains closed was uncertain. Some couples, exhausted by feasting and the intrusion of the ceremony, fell into uneasy sleep. Others, prodded by the memory of the crowd, did their best to fulfill the expectations laid upon them. Either way, their chamber was never free of an invisible audience. For a queen, the burden was immense. Her body was no longer only hers, but the vessel of dynastic survival. If she conceived a son, her place was secure. If she failed or bore only daughters, whispers would grow. Chroniclers wrote as much about beds as about battlefields, noting whether a queen had given her husband heirs, recording pregnancies as if they were state affairs. And so every night was tinged with politics, each turn of the body carrying the weight of succession. The sheets themselves could become evidence. In some courts, bloodied linens from the wedding night were displayed, as proof of consummation, a public token of what had been private. In others, servants reported on what they heard or saw, their testimony forming the basis of political claims. If doubts arose later, if a marriage was challenged, if heirs were questioned, the bedding ceremony became the shield. We saw them laid together, witnesses would swear. We know the union was real. The intimacy of two people became the property of an entire kingdom. Not all bedding ceremonies were equal. In France and England, they often carried the weight of sacred ritual, with priests blessing the chamber and relics placed near the bed. In parts of Germany, the ceremonies could be raucous, with companions stripping the groom or tossing the couple into bed with laughter. In Scandinavia, echoes of older traditions lingered, where fertility rites mixed with Christian blessing, the old gods and the new church overlapping in awkward harmony. Wherever they took place, the result was the same, a marriage made visible through the strange theater of the bed. Some kings embraced the ritual, making light of it, turning the embarrassment into a display of strength. Others endured it grimly, retreating into silence once the door closed. Queens, by contrast, had little choice but to yield. Whether 15 years old or 30, whether marrying for love or alliance, they faced the same ritual stripping away of privacy. Their role was to lie down, to receive, to bear witness with their own bodies. And yet, within this ritual, some found room for quiet resistance. A bride might meet her husband's eyes and choose silence over submission, or she might whisper, words in the dark that were hers alone. The bedding ceremony could dictate the form, but it could not always dictate the heart. Couples who grew to care for one another sometimes found intimacy even within the rigid framework of expectation. Others drifted apart, their union existing only on parchment and in gossip. The bed a hollow symbol rather than a bond. Still, the spectacle mattered most to the world outside. Ambassadors reported on the bedding as if it were a treaty signed. Chronicles preserved it in ink so that centuries later we still read of which king and which queen were seen laid together, as though history itself had been written in their sheets. The ceremony's purpose was not to create love or comfort, but to make history tangible, to turn the act of union into something kingdoms could claim as fact. And in the silence that followed, when the chamber was at last empty and the couple alone, there must have been an unsettling thought. Had they truly consummated their own marriage, or had they only performed it for the eyes of others? By morning, the bedding ceremony was already the talk of the court. Servants carried whispers through corridors, courtiers traded knowing glances, and chroniclers sharpened their quills to record what little they had seen or heard. The union of two houses was now sealed not only in vows but in rumor, in speculation, in the strange weight of public intimacy. What had taken place behind closed curtains no longer belonged to the couple alone. It belonged to everyone who had staked their fortunes on the marriage. For the newlyweds, the consequences of that night stretched far beyond the chamber. If the queen conceived quickly, the ceremony was remembered as a triumph, proof that God had blessed the union. If months or years passed without a child, doubt seeped in, fingers pointed at the bride, her body scrutinized by midwives and priests. Was she barren? Was she cursed? Rarely did anyone accuse the husband, though his body was just as likely to fail as hers. The bed, however, was always laid at the woman's feet. This expectation created tension that grew with each passing year. Some marriages became strained, the silence between husband and wife filled with the unspoken question of heirs. Others grew into uneasy companionship, the couple bound together by duty, even if affection never followed. But whatever the private truth, the bedding ceremony had already declared the marriage real. There was no retreat, no denial, no turning back. At times, the ceremony itself was used as political weapon. If a union soured and annulment was sought, the question of consummation became central. Lawyers and priests argued over whether the bed had truly been shared. Witnesses were summoned to recall whether they had seen the couple laid together, whether they had heard movement or laughter or whispers. The memory of that single night could decide the fate of kingdoms, legitimizing or unraveling entire dynasties. It is easy to imagine how heavy the burden must have felt for a young queen, often no more than 15 or 16. Her very first night with her husband was transformed into evidence, her privacy stripped away not only in the moment but for years to come. Even in later life, her legitimacy as wife and mother could be questioned, and the proof demanded was always the same: what had happened in the bed. Some couples managed to carve out something more within this framework. Kings who grew to cherish their queens softened the weight of expectation with kindness. Queens who gained influence learned to wield the intimacy of the bed as a tool, their whispered counsel shaping decisions of war and peace. Within the rigid structure of the ceremony, Small spaces of humanity opened behind the velvet curtains. Alliances turned into marriages, and marriages, sometimes, into partnerships. They endured it, performed it, and carried on with lives that rarely intersected beyond duty. Their heirs came, their households grew, but the bond between them never deepened. The bedding ceremony had forced them together, but it could not create closeness where none existed. The bed was a contract, not a comfort, in the end. The secret of royal bedding ceremonies lies not in what happened between husband and wife, but in what it revealed about the world around them. Power, lineage, reputation, all were condensed into a single night, a single bed, a single set of sheets. What should have been private was made public. What should have been human was made political. The marriage bed became less a place of love than a ledger of dynasties. And so you are left with the image of a grand chamber, curtains heavy with embroidered gold, witnesses dispersing into the corridors, and two young people left behind in the silence. Their lives, their futures, their kingdoms had been bound by ritual. But the question lingers, when the door finally closed, did they belong to one another, or only to history? You sit on a wooden bench near the chancel rail, the noon light falling in pale squares across the flagstones, waiting your turn while the priest finishes with the miller's wife. The church is cool even in summer. Bees drift in and out through a crack in the shutters. You are not here for absolution alone. You are here because in this parish, as in most of Christendom, the priest is keeper of calendars, conscience, and the bed. He will ask how often you and your spouse join, on which nights, and for what reason. He will not say the word love. He will say duty. He will say order. He will call your union a remedy for desire and a service to God if it seeks children. And you will nod, because that is the language the century has given you. When your name is called, you kneel. The questions arrive softly, as if to blunt their edges. Were you together last Sunday, during the rogation days, in Lent? Did wine loosen your restraint? Did anger send you to bed for the wrong reasons? The priest's tone is gentle, but the ledger behind his words feels cold. He keeps, in his mind, if not in his hands, a scheme of permitted nights and forbidden ones, Advent and Lent, vigils of the greater feasts, days of fasting, the eves of communion weeks and weeks in which your own desire is expected to bow to the ringing of bells. You learn, as every married soul learns, that your chamber has a door that opens into the sacristy. To understand why he asks, you must step into the church's mind. Marriage, the priest will tell you, was given for three ends: children, fidelity, and the cooling of inordinate desire. Pleasure is not forbidden, he says, but it must never command. The body is good, he says, but unruly. It must be bridled like a horse. He speaks of the fall, of how the will lost mastery over the flesh, and he proposes rules as reins. None of this is said harshly. He has delivered these lines 100 times to couples who flush, avert their eyes, and promise to do better. In every parish there are books, or the memory of books, the handbooks for confessors copied in monasteries, the sums of cases written by learned men for the use of simple priests, how to question, how to weigh guilt, what penance to assign. From such guides come the questions you hear, questions that trace their fingers through your sheets. Were you together during menstruation? Did you enter your bed after too much ale? Did you seek union on a day appointed to fasting? Did either of you compel the other without charity? The priest is not married. He will never marry. Yet he holds the keys to your bedroom like a steward assigned to a locked storehouse. What emerges from these conversations is a map crooked, crowded, and difficult to follow by which ordinary people try to steer their most private lives. On some evenings, you count dates by the moon and the saints' days, subtracting Fridays and vigils, setting aside fasting seasons, moving like a cart through a town of narrow alleys. On others, you set the map aside, because winter is long and the hearth is small and closeness warms more than wool. Then you return to the bench, kneel again, and whisper that you failed the calendar. And the priest, who has heard the same confession in 10 voices that week, gives you fasts, prayers, alms, and a brief exhortation to patience. But not all counsel is restraint. There is another thread the priest pulls when he judges it necessary: the debt of marriage. He tells husbands that they owe the body to the wife as the wife owes it to them. He has seen men return from the alehouse, blustering, and he has chided them quietly that drunkenness in the bed is a sin upon sin. He has told wives who refuse always, without cause, that hardness of heart is no virtue. And he has told husbands who demand without mercy that marriage is not dominion, but a pact. He repeats that neither spouse may vow abstinence, vigils, a season of contents without the other's consent. In this way, the Church asserts an odd equality where the world often does not. Both can summon, both can excuse, both must consider. The doctrine is simple in the mouth and complicated in the chamber, but it exists, and some cling to it like a small hook in a storm. Sometimes he intervenes as judge. A husband complains that his wife has withheld herself, claiming illness for months. The priest sends a midwife to look in, to advise on humors and rest, and returns with counsel of moderation and patience. Another woman arrives with bruises hidden beneath her sleeves. The priest cannot undo a household, and he rarely imagines such harm as crime, but he can require penance, forbid the husband the bed for a time, bind him to fasts and alms, threaten public shame from the pulpit if amendment fails. The remedies are blunt. Still, they are sometimes the only ones at hand. The counsel reaches further than you expect. The priest talks, if you ask, of food and timing. He has heard the physicians say that too much heat in the blood makes the mind rash and the body ungoverned. He repeats what he remembers, that spices warm, that wine stirs, that heavy meat before bed clouds the head. He is not a physician. He borrows their language as a man borrows a cloak that is not cut for him. Yet the advice settles: eat simply, especially on eves of feasts. Be moderate, sleep early. Let mornings be for work and evenings for prayer, except when the good order of the household counsels otherwise. For women, he keeps a second set of lines ready. He tells them to rest after childbirth until they have been received back into the church with prayers and thanksgiving. Not because they are defiled, he insists, but because recovery is needed and custom demands it. He warns husbands gently that this is the wife's season, that impatience is a sin against both charity and prudence. He reminds wives that cleanliness is a courtesy to the bed, that herbs in the bath rosemary, sajar a good habit, that linen aired in the sun. carries fewer ills. He is half priest, half household steward in these matters. And if you listen closely, you hear the common sense of old wives braided together with prayers. Behind these prescriptions lies a fear. The age rarely names plainly the fear that desire, if left to itself, will unmake the household's order. A man who rises late and seeks his wife late will rise later still, neglecting fields and rents. A woman exhausted by constant summons will grow hard, resentful, and the house will sour. Children conceived in exhaustion come to grief. Children born into famine perish. The priest knows this in the way a shepherd knows the slope of his hills. He calls what he knows virtue, and sometimes it is, and sometimes it is merely caution. Wrapped in Latin. The counsel differs by rank, though its bones are the same. In a peasant cottage, the priest says, "Remember the fasts, be kind, keep clean sheets if you can, share the bed when the winter bites and the children are asleep by the ashes." In the manor house, he says, "Remember the lineage that depends on you, keep temperance at feasts. Do not exhaust the body you need for heirs. Do not let pride make you disdain the spouse you did not choose." To a knight's household, he adds, "Do not come from the stables stinking of sweat and horse to the lady's bed. Wash, show courtesy. Remember, you are not on campaign." To a noble woman he whispers what he would never print: "If you must refuse, refuse gently, and seek allies your mother, a trusted aunt, the chaplain to help you secure a season of peace." The oddest advice is sometimes the most human. He tells you to speak to each other. Not loudly, walls are thin, and servants talk, but honestly. Agree on nights when no child is likely to wake and ask for water. Agree on mornings when work will suffer if you lie long. Agree on seasons of restraint. Lent, Adventive, only because shared waiting makes shared feasting sweeter. It is not theology so much as craft, the craft of keeping a roof from sagging under unequal weight. There are parts of the counsel that nearly everyone ignores. The old lists that catalog forbidden postures or demand that spouses keep their clothes half on to preserve modesty, illicit nods in the church and smirks in the yard. People do what comfort and custom teach them. Yet even when ignored, the lists shape imagination. They draw a line around the bed and write holy on the inside and shame on the edges. Couples learn to push the line with one shoulder and pull it back with the other. The way a plowman learns to steal a foot from a lord's field and then give back to keep the peace from time to time. A pilgrim passes through and repeats a sermon heard in a city. A friar said that spouses who approach one another kindly do not sin at all. Another said that to seek pleasure beyond the need for children is venial, but cured by charity. Another thundered that every touch deserves a lash. The priest, hearing these reports, shrugs and returns to his parish measure. Severity softens. When faced with faces he knows, he holds the line because the line must be held by someone, but he moves it for reasons no book could anticipate: after a stillbirth, after a drought, after a winter that took 2 infants from one hearth. There are victories here, small and seldom recorded. A husband who once boasted in the alehouse now speaks quietly and listens. A wife who once hid in the loft to avoid the bed now negotiates Sundays, no, workdays, yes, fasting seasons we will try. A couple who quarreled through spring finds in autumn a rhythm that keeps peace without extinguishing warmth. No chronicle notices, but the village is different because two people learn to carry desire like a bucket, balanced between them, and there are failures. A man decides that the debt he is owed is simple ownership and darkens his house with it. A woman, terrified by childbirth, turns cold and never warms again, and no counsel reaches her. The priest writes penances until the numbers lose meaning, and the couple lives out their years like two stones under a hedge. When they die, the parish speaks kindly of their thrift and says nothing of their bed. You walk home from the church with the priest's words still hanging about your shoulders, like a cloak too heavy for summer. You will keep some of his counsel. You will forget some. You will do what every household does, adapt it to the grain of your life. You will mark the feasts in charcoal on a beam, scratch little crosses for the days set aside, and then ignore the marks when snow piles against the door and the long night asks for warmth. You will bring to the bed not only a body, but a storywork done. Bread needed, a child soothed, a small victory won, a small cruelty apologized for, and you will hope that the story softens what the rules harden. If you ask whether the priest's advice makes marriages holier, the age gives two answers. The first speaks from the pulpit. Yes, because the rules erect a fence around the garden where life begins. The second speaks in kitchens after midnight, sometimes, but only when the fence has a gate that the couple holds the key to. Both answers are true, and both are lies, because the truth sits not in rules or evasions, but in the countless decisions two people make with the door closed and the candle low. You keep returning to the bench, to the questions, to the penances, not because you are a coward before rules, but because you want your house to stand, and your children to live, and your soul to be at peace. You keep returning because the priest, for all his borrowed learning and bachelor ignorance, is the only man allowed to bless your confusion. He cannot untangle the knot he ties with his counsel, but he can say over you the words you need to hear. Go, be patient, be kind, keep the feast and the fast, and when you fail, return. And so the priest becomes, without meaning to, a craftsman of beds as well as souls. He cannot tuck the sheets or bank the fire, but he sets the measure by which many try to live. His advice is sometimes wise, sometimes foolish, sometimes harmful, sometimes healing. It is always certain in tone and uncertain in effect, like a map of roads drawn by someone who has never walked them. As you reach your door and lift the latch, the bells begin again. You count them, not to learn the hour. You know it by the light, but to feel the rhythm you live under. The bed inside is small. It will hold both duty and solace if you let it, if you can, if the counsel you received this noon can be bent without breaking. And standing on the threshold, you ask yourself the question that every married soul in your parish has asked at least once. Did the priest's advice give you a way to belong to one another more kindly, or did it simply give your love another set of rules to fail? The candle burns low, throwing shadows across the timbered ceiling, and the house is silent except for the settling creak of beams. In this quiet, the words of the priest drift back, the calendar of prohibitions and allowances, repeating like a chant: no on Sundays, no in Lent, no on vigils, no after wine. Yes, when children are needed. Yes, when temperance is kept. A couple lies, side by side, listening to their own breath, deciding not in words, but in the tilt of a shoulder, whether tonight will be obedience or defiance. These choices were rarely simple. The church calendar was thick with restrictions, yet the rhythms of rural life demanded flexibility. Harvest left bodies aching. Winter brought cold that no cloak could wholly banish, and the bed was sometimes the only warmth two people had. Many ignored the rules in practice, but the guilt lingered. A husband might whisper to his wife that they would confess next week, pay their penance in fasts or coins, and the matter would be settled. They learned to treat confession like a ledger. Sin entered, penance paid, account balanced. Others learned to use the priest's teachings as shields. A wife who needed rest after childbirth or illness would invoke the words she had heard in church: abstain until purification, abstain for recovery. A husband who wanted more than she could bear might be reminded of the debt of marriage, the duty of kindness, the danger of sinning against charity. Each could twist the rules to guard themselves. Some did so gently, others sharply, but all learned to wield the language of confession like a tool. There were cases whispered in villages where couples used the priest as arbiter. A wife might confess that her husband demanded too much, and the priest, bound by his manuals, would instruct moderation. The husband, kneeling later, might be told the same, reminded that to exhaust his wife was to endanger her body and his soul. In this way, the priest became a quiet mediator, not by intention but by necessity. His counsel was the only recognized authority both could appeal to, and though his remedies were blunt penances, alms, days of abstinence, they sometimes eased the burden. But confession could cut both ways. A man might accuse his wife of refusing too often, and the priest would remind her of the marital debt. A woman might complain of neglect, and the priest would scold the husband for failing his duty. Neither side could claim complete ownership, though in practice men bore less risk of censure. The manuals spoke of equality, but the world tilted otherwise. Even so, the principle that each owed the other lingered, a fragile balance that sometimes offered women a foothold they found nowhere else. There were those who learned to confess strategically in noble courts where alliances hung on heirs. A queen might confess her weariness or her fear of childbirth, hoping to gain a season of reprieve. A king, meanwhile, might confess lust in vague terms, careful never to give his enemies words that could be twisted into proof of scandal. For peasants, confession was simpler, but no less careful. They spoke enough to ease their conscience, not enough to invite gossip. They learned to confess like farmers sowing seed, scattering words with calculation, keeping the best grain back for themselves. Physicians, too, entered the conversation. Some priests borrowed their advice, telling couples to time their union for certain days when the humors were in balance, when the body was strong, when the air was cool. A husband might believe that a child conceived after too much wine would be weak. A wife might believe that conceiving during a thunderstorm invited trouble. These beliefs mingled with the priest's cautions until the bed was surrounded not only by saints' days but by superstitions. Desire became a puzzle of calendars, humors, and fears. Yet within all this, couples found ways to claim small freedoms. A husband might feign piety, announcing that they should abstain during Lent, while in truth he was weary and welcomed the excuse. A wife might whisper that tonight was forbidden, though she knew no such rule, buying herself a night of peace. Both learned to navigate between doctrine and survival, bending the rules until they fit the shape of their lives. The priest's voice lingered, but it could not silence the deeper voice of necessity. What emerges from these stories is not simply obedience, but negotiation. Couples did not live by rules alone. They lived by bargains struck in the dark, by compromises whispered under blankets. Confession gave them the language to argue, to refuse, to permit. It made the bed a place not only of duty, but of diplomacy, where two people balanced each other's needs against the demands of heaven. And so, behind every confession, there was a calculation: how much truth to tell, how much to hide, how much to use against or for the one who shared your bed. The priest may have believed he governed the chamber, but in truth, the chamber governed itself, bending the rules until they served the household. The lingering question is this: were these rules instruments of order, or were they simply tools that couples reshaped into weapons of survival, turning doctrine into a language by which they could quietly claim power over their own nights? The confessional bench, the whispered questions, the lists of forbidden nights, all of it was meant to impose order on private lives. Yet, in the long run, priestly advice did more than weigh individual couples with guilt. It shaped households, villages, and even dynasties. The marriage bed was not a private chamber alone. It was the foundation of inheritance, property, and power. And the priests, through their counsel, became quiet architects of that foundation. Consider the household of a wealthy merchant. His wife, guided by the priest, insists on abstinence during Lent. The husband, though impatient, agrees at least partly because he knows the priest would censure him if he confessed otherwise. Their restraint means fewer children than they might otherwise have had, but the children who are born inherit more wealth, the family line more secure. Advice about calendars, meant to curb lust, ends by shaping the arithmetic of inheritance. In a village, the priest's reminders about the debt of marriage prevent some husbands from neglecting their wives. A woman can appeal to his words, reminding her husband that he owes her attention as much as she owes him. It is a fragile protection, imperfectly applied, but it offers a sliver of dignity in a world where women's voices often carry little weight. In these cases, the church's meddling gives her leverage. The confessional becomes a tool not only of control but of survival for kings and queens. Priestly advice had consequences even greater. Chroniclers record arguments between monarchs and confessors, priests insisting on abstinence during holy days, kings protesting that dynastic heirs could not be delayed by the turning of the church calendar. Priests urged Henry II of England, for instance, to restrain himself, while queens sought seasons of abstinence after repeated childbirths. In such disputes, the line between sin and politics blurred. A priest who withheld absolution could weaken a king's legitimacy. A queen who invoked the rules could delay the king's advances. The bed became a battlefield where theology and dynasty collided. Some rulers bent the rules openly, others bent them quietly, confessing later, trusting absolution to wash away disobedience. But the effect was the same. Priestly council set the terms. And even when defied, it remained the language through which defiance was framed. The church's hand lay heavy on every royal sheet, its shadow stretching from the altar into the chamber. The advice extended even to widows and remarriages. Priests instructed widows on how long to abstain, when they could remarry, and under what terms. These rules shaped alliances, determined dowries, and influenced the politics of entire regions. What began as counsel for the bed reached into the highest matters of law and land, and yet, despite all the weight of regulation, ordinary people learned to live beyond it. They learned to smile at the priest's words, to nod, to pay their penance, and then to carry on according to the needs of their households. They took what was useful, discarded what was impossible, and reshaped the rest into a language of bargaining between husband and wife. In practice, the priest's advice mattered less as a rigid set of rules and more as a script couples could use in their own negotiations over time. This dual life, obedience in public, negotiation in private, became the quiet habit of Europe. It is why the records are full of rules, but the reality was more flexible, more human, more practical. Priests imagined themselves guardians of morality, but in truth, they were participants in a much larger conversation, one carried out in whispers, between spouses after the door was closed. And so, the final lesson of priestly counsel on bedroom conduct is not about obedience at all. It is about adaptation. The rules pressed, couples bent, priests scolded, couples confessed. Life went on. Desire could not be erased. It could only be renamed, postponed, or excused. And through this endless cycle of restraint and release, families grew, dynasties rose, villages endured. The thought lingers: did the priests truly guide the marriage bed, or did they simply give couples a language of sin and duty with which to hide what they would have done anyway? The cottage was dark long before the castle lamps were dimmed. Smoke clung to the rafters, the hearth gave off more ash than flame, and the straw bed waited in the corner like a heap of autumn fields brought indoors. For a peasant wife, the bed was not velvet, not silk, not a stage for witnesses. It was a bundle of straw stuffed into a coarse sack, covered with a linen sheet, if the family could afford one, or with nothing but rough wool when times were lean. And yet that straw bed was the center of survival, as essential as the plow or the oven. The wife lay down last. She tended the fire, hushed the children, pushed the shutters closed against the night, and then crept into her place beside her husband. Sometimes children shared the same sack, curling at their parents' feet for warmth, their small bodies wrapped in scraps of old cloth. Privacy was unknown, modesty impossible. The bed was not a sanctuary, but a crowded island of warmth in a sea of cold. The straw itself told a story of poverty and labor. Fresh straw crackled beneath the weight of bodies, but within weeks it grew damp, matted, and rank. Lice and fleas bred in it. The smell of sweat, smoke, and livestock clung to the fibers. Peasant wives shook out the bedding when they could, stuffed in new straw after harvest, and washed the sheets if they had any in the river until the fabric thinned to threads. The work was endless, yet necessary, because the bed was where sickness bred as surely as life. For women of the fields, the bed was less about rest than recovery. They bent their backs in the soil, carried water, spun wool, bore children, and when their bodies gave way, they dropped onto straw to gather strength enough to rise again. It was a place of exhaustion, not leisure. They knew the rhythm: wake before dawn, labor until dusk, collapse at night. The bed gave no comfort beyond what their own tiredness forced upon it. And yet, despite its roughness, the bed carried its own kind of intimacy. Husbands and wives pressed together for warmth. Bodies sharing heat through long winters when the thatch roof leaked and the wind clawed at the walls. Desire was dulled by hunger, sharpened by the need for children to work the fields, and governed by the church's endless calendars. Still, in the dark, beneath the scratch of wool and the whisper of straw, couples found moments of closeness, sometimes tender, sometimes mechanical, always bound to survival. For a peasant wife, her worth was measured in the children she bore, the household she kept, and the endurance she showed. The bed was where each of these measures converged. Pregnancies came in quick succession, sometimes a child every year, sometimes more. Miscarriages and infant deaths were common. Women died in childbirth so often that the bed, soaked in sweat and blood, became as much a deathbed as a marriage bed. Each time she lay down, a wife knew she might not rise again. Still, she returned to it, because survival demanded it. Children themselves transformed the bed into a crowded nest. Infants nursed at their mothers' sides. Toddlers clambered over tired limbs. Older children whispered themselves to sleep in corners nearby. The straw crackled with every turn, and the air grew heavy with the smell of unwashed bodies. Yet in that crowded bed, a family survived the cold. In the harshest winters, with snow piled against the door, that shared warmth meant life or death. The wife was keeper of the bed as much as of the hearth. She shook the straw, washed the linen, checked for vermin, whispered prayers over her children as they drifted to sleep. She knew the dangers that lurked there, lice that carried fever, dampness that bred coughs, closeness that spread plague. Still, she tended it, because there was no alternative. The bed was not luxury, it was necessity. Sometimes the bed was a place of joy, a harvest safely gathered, a festival day, a rare night when laughter lingered even after the fire burned loathing. The straw bed was a place of shared relief, a reminder that life, for all its hardship, still carried warmth. More often, it was a place of endurance, where hunger gnawed and children coughed through the night. And so, the bed of a peasant wife was both cradle and coffin, comfort and burden. It held the weight of generations, the marks of labor, the breath of life, and the sigh of death. It was ordinary, humble, scratchy, and sometimes filthy, but it was also the axis around which her entire life turned. And in the dark, as she lay listening to the breath of her husband, the shifting of her children, the scratching of straw, she may have asked herself, was this bed hers at all, or only another tool of survival she was fated to tend until her strength was gone? The straw has been turned and shaken, the children hushed into stillness, and the door barred against the wind. In the dimness of the cottage, the peasant wife lies awake, listening to the rasp of her husband's breath and the faint scratching of mice in the rafters. The straw bed, though rough and itching, holds the entire weight of her household. By day she bends her back in the fields. By night she bends her spirit beneath the burdens of the bed. The life of a peasant wife was bound. 2 cycles of toil, and the bed was where those cycles converged. It was where she recovered from aching limbs, where she conceived the children who would one day share her labor, where she nursed infants while her body had scarcely healed from childbirth, and where she surrendered to illness when work no longer allowed her to rise. Her bed was not a symbol of love or luxury. It was an emblem of survival in its barest form. Fresh straw was a fleeting luxury. At harvest time, sacks could be filled anew, and for a few weeks the bed crackled cleanly beneath tired bodies. But winter came quickly, damp creeping into the straw, fleas breeding in the warmth of flesh. Sheets, if there were any, had to be scrubbed in cold rivers until hands turned raw. Soap was precious, and most beds were scented not with lavender, but with the sharpness of sweat, animals, and smoke. Yet this was life, unadorned, unsoftened, endured. The wife's duties extended even here. She shook out the bedding, aired what she could, picked at seams, patched holes. A clean bed, however humble, meant fewer illnesses, fewer complaints, fewer nights of children scratching until their skin bled. She bore these responsibilities quietly because in every corner of her world, women's labor was invisible unless it failed. Only when the straw reeked or vermin spread did anyone remark upon the bed she kept. Desire, too, was shaped by the bed's poverty. With children pressed against their parents' sides, intimacy was difficult, almost impossible. Couples learned to steal moments surely before children stirred, late when they had finally drifted into slumber. There was no privacy, only opportunity carved out of exhaustion. For the wife, such moments were less about passion than about obligation and the relentless march of pregnancies that followed. Her womb was as busy as her hands, and her bed never empty of demands. Childbirth transformed the straw bed into a battlefield. When the pains began, midwives were summoned, the husband banished to the yard or the alehouse, and the bed became a place of agony. Women clutched the straw, bit down on cloth, screamed prayers to saints. Blood soaked through the bedding, and infants came into the world, slick with sweat and tears. Sometimes the mother rose again after a few days, weary but alive. Sometimes she did not. In too many cottages, the bed that had seen union one night saw death the next. And yet the bed also knew tenderness. On rare evenings, when bellies were full, when laughter from a festival still lingered in the air, when a child's fever had broken and relief swept through the house, the straw bed became a place of gratitude. Husband and wife, pressed close against the cold, found warmth not only in flesh, but in survival itself. These were fleeting moments, but they gave meaning to the long grind of hardship. Even sickness carried its rituals here. When plague or fever struck, the bed became a prison. The wife nursed her children through coughs and sweats, herself sick but unwilling to lie down fully while others needed her. Neighbors left bread at the door. Priests whispered last rites over straw where bodies burned with fever. The bed, so often the center of life, became the place of endings. Families mourned where they had once found warmth, the straw carrying both memory and grief. Still, the bed was indispensable. Without it, winter nights would have stolen more lives. Childbirth would have been even crueler. Sickness would have spread unchecked. It was the most basic of tools, and for the peasant wife, tending it was as sacred as tending the hearth. It was her task to keep it livable, to endure its discomfort, to survive its burdens. Lying there in the dark, She may have wondered if her life would ever be more than this. Straw that pricked her skin, children that tugged at her body, a husband whose weight pressed beside her, and the endless cycle of labor that began anew each dawn. And yet, even in her weariness, she knew the bed was the thread that bound her family together. Without it, there was no warmth, no children, no survival. And so the question hovers over the cottage. Was the straw bed a curse that trapped her in hardship? Or was it the quiet, scratchy miracle that allowed her household to endure another winter? The bargaining begins long before the wedding feast, in a room that smells of wax and wool, where a notary dips his pen and two families sit across a plank table like merchants settling a shipment. You are there in spirit, looking over his shoulder as he scratches the first necessary words. Who gives, who receives, and for what promise? This is not romance, it is arithmetic. The marriage will bind to households only if the numbers hold. In this century, love rides in the last cart. The first carries the dowry. They speak first of coin because coin is simple. A sum is promised, payable in parts, half at betrothal, half at the door of the church, or in 3 tranches tied to harvests. Then they move to goods, because in most houses, goods are more real than money. A cow in calf, a chest, 2 pots of decent size, a pair of sheets, if fortune smiles. The notary writes as if such things were as grand as manners, and in these rooms they are. The bed appears early in the list, not because it is fine, but because it is necessary. Sometimes the contract names it outright one bed with its appurtenances, or else the household linen that will make a mattress worth lying on. If the family is modest, the bed in question is a sack of ticking to be filled with straw and a rope frame bought second-hand or knotted from hemp in the yard. If the family can stretch further, the dowry provides a proper frame oak if they boast, ash or elm if they are practically in, a cord key to tighten the web when it sags. If wealthy, the bed is a thing made to be looked at as much as slept. On-turned posts, a low canopy, hangings pieced from wool, maybe a fine coverlet that will be mentioned in wills 2 generations hence. For Italians of the trading towns, the dowry chest is painted, a cassone with hunting scenes, and inside it lies the true treasure, linen. Linen is the quiet engine of the dowry. You run your fingers over bolts that took years to coax from flax, sewn in spring, pulled by hand, retted in ponds that stank, broken, scutched, hackled, spun, woven narrow on a home loom or broader on a town one. The notary tries to be precise. 4 sheets of best linen, 6 of lesser, 8 pillow coverings, 1 bolster, perhaps a tablecloth to grace a feast day. Every piece is counted. Every edge has been hemmed by someone's mother. Some women mark corners with stitches initials or a bit of red thread in a pattern the family will recognize if dispute comes. This is not vanity, it is proof. If the marriage fails or death arrives too soon, those marks will testify to what belongs to whom. The bed in these contracts is more than furniture. It is a promise that the new wife will not begin her life lying on boards. It is also insurance. In many places, what the bride brings may remain technically hers, or hers to reclaim if widowed, even if it lives in her husband's house. The law in one town calls it paraphernalia, in another trousseau. In another, it simply goes unnamed and unquestioned because custom is older than parchment. A man hungry for coin may try to sell a pot or a rug when winter bites. A neighbor will ask whether the mark on the seam is the wife's. If it is, the sale fails. The bed and the goods that clothe it are a woman's last redoubt. The groom's side offers its own pledge. In some regions, the morning gift is promised a glove full of silver, a small parcel of land, a rent for life to be delivered the day after the wedding, when the bed has done its first duty. In others, English law speaks the word dower, the fraction of his holding she will hold for her lifetime if he dies first. The numbers differ from market to market, but the idea is the same. The bride does not walk into the marriage empty-handed, and she should not be thrust out empty-handed if fortune turns. You are watching a bargain being built that will keep bread in someone's mouth 20 years hence. The notary's pen slows when they come to securities, because securities matter. If the groom's father stands as surety for the dowry, his vineyard or his mill may be named as the guarantee. If the bride's uncle vouches, he may list the cow and calf as collateral for the last tranche. These words seem cold, but they are the seams that keep households stitched. Too many promises are easy in the glow of feast candles. The ink must hold when winter comes. The bed, the sheets, the chest, these are not trinkets. They are the scaffolding of a house. You might think the bride has no place at this table. Often, she does not. Sometimes she is present but silent, her hands folded, eyes on the notary's moving feather. Sometimes, especially in towns where trade has taught daughters numbers, she asks one question that matters. Will the bed and linen be counted among goods to be returned to me if I am widowed? An aunt will cough to hide a smile. The notary will pause. The groom's father, if he is clever, will say yes without fuss, winning favor at the price of a mattress. These are small victories won in rooms where large defeats are common. Outside the parchment world, the dowry has already begun to walk. In the weeks before the wedding, women assemble the trousseau like a campaign army musters stores. A chest fills in layers, sheets aired in autumn sun, a rolled mattress tick, a folded rug, a packet of needles tied with thread, 2 shirts for the husband, because a prudent wife begins married life with a gift to soften demands. A ribbon scented in herbs goes in last, not because it matters to law, but because it matters to sleep. The chest's lock clicks. A key is tied on a ribbon to a wrist. When the procession comes, neighbors see with their eyes what the notary wrote down. This woman brings warmth in poorer cottages. The dowry is a bed, more in name than reality. A girl may bring a straw tick she and her mother wove from sacking, patched in 3 places. A rope she braided herself, a single sheet, a pot, and a goat tethered outside. It is not much, but it is something, and in this economy, something is a wall against the wind. In some villages, the custom is that a bride receives from her father a 1/4 share of his bed, the best sheet if he has one, or the upper bed if he is old and will soon move to a pallet by the hearth. Such gifts read odd to you, living in a world of mattresses that will never be listed in inventory. Here they are, as real as coin. The bed is displayed on the wedding day, not because anyone is eager to see it, but because display is a kind of legal speech. A chest carried through a lane is a declaration as loud as a trumpet. The bargain has been fulfilled. The bride's family has put skin in the game. The new household begins with something besides hope. In towns, guild brothers sometimes escort the chest. In villages, friends carry it and expect drink. Children trail behind, touching the wood, whistling low when a corner of fine linen slips into view. The sight teaches them a lesson they will remember when their turn comes. Marriages are built of thread and wood as much as of words. Once the chest reaches its new corner, the bed ceases to be a list and becomes a task. The wife unpacks, airs the sheets if the day allows, tightens ropes, shakes straw into the tick, and begins the quiet work of making comfort from materials that do not wish to be comfortable. If she is of a mind to mark her realm, she turns down a corner in a way her mother did, a fold that can be recognized in a glance. She is saying something old. This bed is where this marriage will be measured, by warmth kept and children raised and sickness survived. DOWRIES do not only secure beds, they purchase silence in quarrels and words in councils. A wife whose dowry was heavy may speak in a tone light of apology. A husband whose father took too much on credit may discover that his mother-in-law's voice travels farther than his in family meetings. The law rarely admits such balances. The house feels them daily. When a husband grows careless with money, sells a cow without consent, or loses coin at dice, a wife may remind him, softly or not, that the sheet under his shoulder was paid for by her people. This is not romance either. It is ballast. The bargain has thorns. If a dowry is small, a woman's place is small with it, and the bed becomes a site of surrender with little to soften it. If the dowry is large, it can become a leash, a line back to her father's door that is tugged. Whenever her husband displeases him, the bed is not a neutral object. It is a ledger: who paid, who owes, who may claim,